My name is Stanislaw Robert Liberta, and today we're going to be talking all about keyframes in Apple Motion. If you're brand new to Apple Motion and you haven't really used it before, I really recommend checking out my introduction to Apple Motion video I have on YouTube. In most basic terms, a keyframe is a point of information that is assigned to a specific time. So in my inspector here and in my rectangle, at 0, 0, my rectangle is occupying this X and this Y coordinate, and it has a keyframe on it. You can see that is in my timeline right here. Further along my timeline, I've got another keyframe, and if I scroll this back out, you can see that my rectangle is moved between those, and my X and Y coordinates are different. So between these two, I have a change happening. So anything that's moving or anything that's animated typically is done with either behaviors or keyframes in Apple Motion. So let's go ahead and get started. I've got a video and I want to put some titles on this. Now the first thing that you're going to notice is that this is a 1080p screen here, and my actual Shanghai video is much larger than that. If I go ahead and I fit this, so I'm just going to scale this out to maybe 50%, you can see that my frame is much bigger than that. Now that's great for me because what I want to do is I want to scale this and kind of move the position in here. So I'm going to go to the very beginning of my timeline here with my raw Shanghai, and I'm opening up the inspector and I'm making sure that I'm in this specific group and this layer. And I'm going to go ahead and add a keyframe on my position, which is right here, and my scale. Notice I've got a lot of different scales and different positions that I can open up and twirl down. For our purposes right now, I'm just going to leave the position open and the scale as is. And this video is going to end up being about maybe 5 to 10 seconds. So I'm thinking about how exactly I want this laid out. So I'm going to go ahead and move to maybe the 5-second mark. And at this point, I want this to be scaled up, and I want this to be moved over. Now I have two different ways I can do this. If I change anything in my inspector here, that's automatically going to create a keyframe. And you'll also notice that I have a motion path in here. So what this means is now I have a keyframe. I have this moving from one point to another point there. All right, I'm just going to undo that. And let's go to my 5-second mark. Or I can actually physically change this number here as well. So notice I'm doing the same kind of thing. If I move it this way or if I use this number, it accomplishes the same thing. I can also go ahead and scale this up. And when I scale it up using the transform tools here, you'll notice that it's also changing my X and Y coordinates. That's not what I want in this case, so I'm just going to undo. And I want this to be scaled up here. So I'm going to go ahead and make that at about 143%. So I'm really just kind of setting my scene here. Now, if I play this back, you would think that it's going to scale and move its position. And the reason for that is because I had a keyframe starting and a keyframe ending here. All right. So far, so good. I'm going to refine this just a little bit more, and I'm just going to go ahead and throw a color correction filter on here. So very brief introduction to filters. I have another video talking all about these. These are basically effects that I can play on here, and I'm just going to go into my filters, color correction, and I'm just going to add a color balance to this. And I'm going to go in my inspector here, and we're just going to adjust the shadows, make them a little bit more red, and make my midtones a little bit more blue. Let's work with that a little bit more. And then my highlights, I'll probably add just a little bit of a blue tint to that as well. One last thing I'm going to do to this is I'm actually going to add a vignette. I could search for all of these. I'm just going to go to the very bottom here and just type in vignette. And I'm going to plop that right onto my raw Shanghai as well. All right. So far, so good. So I've got my original scene here. I have this kind of scaling up. Notice that the vignette is also scaling with it. The reason for that is because the vignette and the color balance are actually tied to this particular layer and not the group. So now I've got a nice clean surface here. I'm going to select my rectangle here in my shape tools, and I'm just going to freehand draw out a nice rectangle here. And right away you can see that that's created a new group and it's made a new layer here called rectangle. I'm just going to drag that back to the very beginning so that way it starts right there. And what I want to happen is I want an outline of this to draw on. So I'm going to have to go into my rectangle here, and I'm going to turn off the fill and turn on the outline. And to get that draw on look, so I want this to draw on, so I'm going to take this first keyframe here, this first point offset, and I'm going to make a keyframe with it at 100%. And we're going to take this down to about 15 frames here and drag that to 0. So basically what that's doing is it is drawing that layer on. You'll notice though, however, it starts at 0, and I don't want it to start right away. Maybe I want it to start at 15 frames instead of ending at 15 frames. Well, how can I adjust these keyframes? Well, I could remove them, so I could select one of them and actually hit delete, and that'll delete a keyframe. Or what I can do is I can select both of them here and just drag them over. So what this is doing is that this is just offsetting the time in which that it is animating. So there we go. Now you can see that that is animating on. Perfect. Now I also want another line kind of animating in there. So I'm going to go ahead and grab another shape tool, and I'm just going to call it, this one is just called line. And I'm making sure that I'm in the same group. In fact, let's go ahead and name this, call this shapes. And don't want it to start at exactly the same time. I'm going to go ahead and start it right about here. And I'm just going to place a line. To get a nice straight line, I'm holding on to Shift. And there we go. You'll notice that this line on my actual timeline here has a rounded edge. By default, all of these different shapes will have a rounded edge. If you want that to be squared, like in my example, we're going to go into the Shape and Style, where we have our fill or outline. And I can change the joint to square, the start cap to square, and the end cap to square. And now you can see that that is made a nice square. Now that line is a little thick for me there too, so I'm going to change that width to about a 5. And I'm just going to adjust the position of that. That's just a little off to the side. Okay, very good. Now if again I want this animating here, I'm going to go ahead and go into the shape and go to the offset again. Make a keyframe. And animate it. You notice every time I'm kind of changing a value once I have a keyframe, that is creating one for me. I'm just offsetting this a little bit so that way I have my animations kind of staggered. All right. I'm going to go ahead and select my text tool. Just make some text. And click and drag, and that'll make a text box. And then in this text box, I'm going to go ahead and put in my text. And I'm going to just select that here, make that a little bit larger, and I'm going to just fix my alignment to the center here. Let's make that quite a bit bigger. And we'll actually move the properties of that down here. I'm going to go ahead and make this into a new group. So the way I can do that is I'm just going to drag this off. And as soon as I drag below all the rest of my groups, it makes a new group. And we're going to call this one here text title. And in my example, you saw that it was kind of animating from this line here. So it was actually invisible behind this line. The way we're going to do that is with a mask. So what a mask does is it kind of reveals something or hides something. So in my example here, I'm selecting my text title, and I'm going to use this tool, which is our rectangular mask, and I'm just going to drag across here. Now what this does is anything within this box in this layer is going to show up. So what exactly does that mean? So let me go to my animating keyframes text here, and I'm going to drop this below this mask. So you can see this mask is right at this line. I'm going to drop this animating keyframes right below here, and it looks like it disappears. The reason for that is because I have that mask there. Now, if you're looking for more information about masks, I have another tutorial all about masks, so be sure to check that out in the future. But for right now, I just want this to be starting right here, and then we're going to animate this moving forward. So for beginning here, make a keyframe in the Y transformation. And we're going to move that up. And I'm just eyeballing it here. So if I play this back, we can see there's our animating keyframes. And I want that to happen a little bit earlier. So I'm actually going to take this whole title here and just scoot it back. I want this to pop up as that finishes drawing there. So you can see that's right about there. And I'm just going to make sure that my layer extends to the end there. If I don't, it'll disappear. I'm just going to go ahead, and if I right click, I can force a new group right here. And in this new group, just going to make another text box. Select that. I'm going to make that just a little larger. And it looks like at the very end here, I need another dash. And what I want to do with this one here is the same concept. So I want this one to be, kind of coming out from that top line again. So I'm going to first create a mask. So we've got that. And I'm just going to animate my Apple motion here. So again, I'm making sure that I'm actually on the text layer and not the group. So I'm just going to go ahead and move this guy straight up here. So it's hidden behind that mask. Make a keyframe. Go a little bit further and scroll down. And then once it's actually down here, I'm going to add a second set of keyframes here. And that's going to be under my text. And that's actually going to be my tracking, right? So I'm using this keyframe as kind of a guide for where my next one is going to be. So I'm going to go ahead and make a tracking keyframe here and take this about 4 seconds and just kind of expand that just a little bit. Okay, now we can play that back and let's see what that looks like so far. I've got that scrolling in. I've got my different shapes coming up, and now my text. There's just a couple things I want to do here really quick. The first one is I want this text to stick out from this background a little bit. You can see it's just a little hard to read. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to animate an opacity of this background box here. So I'm actually going to create another rectangle here. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to duplicate this and then make this fairly dark and animate the opacity. So that way we have a little bit of a black box here for this text to stand up in. So going under my rectangle here, and I'm going to just go to Edit, Duplicate, or Command D. And it's going to say Rectangle Copy. I'm going to rename that right away and just call this Black Box. And while we're in here, let's go ahead and rename the rest of our other title. So we'll call this one Subtitle. And I'm just going to collapse those. I'm going to hit Command left bracket to place it underneath. So there we have our text title, our subtitle, our shapes, and our background, so everything's nice and tidy. And I'm going to go under our black box, which, if you'll notice, has that same animation that we had before from our style and our first point offset, because it's a duplicate copy of that. Now, I want to get rid of those keyframes here because I don't need that. In fact, I could probably just turn off that outline and you'll notice that that's disappeared. But if I wanted to get rid of these keyframes here, you'll notice that I could click right to the right side of our keyframe here. And I've got this little pull tab. And if I click on here, I can disable the animation. And so that's just taking all the animation off. And instead, what I want to do is I want to add a fill. And I'm just going to add this fill, and we're going to make this fairly dark here. And we're going to animate this opacity here. So you'll notice I've got this opacity. So first, I'm going to have it start with nothing there. Wait for this text to start filling in. So right about here, we'll add a keyframe. And as that text is coming in, we'll make that just a bit darker in the background. In fact, let's make that really dark. It's just like a solid black. Okay, really good. One more thing I want to add is just a little bit of music. I'm going to go ahead and place this in my timeline. I'm using Dim Light from Poddington Bear. And you'll notice if I put it into my timeline, I don't see it here in my layers or in here. What I have to do is I have to make sure that I have my audio turned on. That's in this bottom right corner here. You'll notice it says Show Hide Audio Timeline. And if I go ahead and click that, now you can see there is my actual track. Now again, I want this whole duration to only be about 5 seconds. So you'll notice this is my duration. I can change this right to 5 seconds. And now there is my total duration of 5 seconds. And now that I've got this music track in here, I'm going to go into the inspector for my audio track, and I just want this to fade out right about 4 seconds. So I've selected my audio, and I'm going to level. I'm creating a keyframe. And right from about 4 seconds to 5, I'm going to drop that down to negative infinity. So when I play this back, it has the audio come in and then fades out. Now I want all this to fade in and fade out too. So one last thing I can do here is I can take all my different objects here. So I have my different layers here. So there's my shape, my subtitle, my text layer. Inside each one of those, I've got all the rest of these different layers, right? But I just want this all collapsed right now so it's nice and clean. And I'm going to take all of these, background, my shapes, subtitle, project, and I'm going to right click and group. And now that's put it all in one master group. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and call this master. And what I'm going to do is under the properties of this master group, I'm going to go under the opacity and just create a keyframe right away and drop it to 0%. And notice that made my whole screen black. It's because everything in this group now has its opacity turned down to 0 because it is part of this master group. I'm taking it to about 15 frames and changing this to 100%, where now it'll fade in. And I can take this back to about 4 seconds and 15 frames. Make another keyframe. And then at 5 seconds, drop this again to 0. So now you can see my 4 keyframes here. Starts at 0, goes to 100, stays at 100 till here, and then from 100 to 0. I'm just going to hit this loop button here so we can take a look at this. And we have our animation here. So I have the scaling up, I've got my text coming in, my lines animating, my background animating. Now, is that all we can do with keyframes? No, we can do a lot more with keyframes, and to be honest, normally I would work with these keyframes a little bit more. All we've done here is specified point A to point B kind of changes. What we can do is click on this button right down here in the bottom right corner, and this is our keyframe editor. What this lets us do is actually finesse and work with our keyframes a little bit more. So I'm going to turn off this video and this audio timeline, and I'm going to turn on this keyframe editor. And what this does is it actually shows me my keyframes in time here. So anything that actually has a keyframe, I can view a little bit better. So right now what we're looking at here is it's at 0%, goes to 100, at 100, down to 0 in a straight line. If I go to, let's say, my original rectangle here, you can see there's my outline from point A to point B. I can right-click on these and actually change the interpolation. So if I ease this, this has created a different kind of movement for this animation. And what this lets us do is it kind of finesses our animation a little bit more. So maybe we have something start out pretty fast and then speeds up over time. If you found this useful, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube page where I've got more tutorials and gear reviews for different pieces of production equipment. Again, my name is Stanislaw Robert Liberta with AV Ultra, and hopefully you found this useful.